Hello and welcome to the slightly earlier Workathlete Performance Chat. Very topical, once again, as we always try to be. Rach McKenzie's here alongside myself, and we're going to chat all things hashtag IWD. Now, Rach, happy world in the... Well, I'm not even going to say it. Do you know what? Do you know why? Because yesterday was a very bizarre social media experiment about International Women's Day. And for your part, Rach, you mentioned that it wasn't always that well received.
Yeah, and I think, like a lot of these celebratory days or these days that raise profile or awareness, the intention behind them is really good. But quite often we see lots of virtue signalling without any real action. And there was some of the tweets and feeds that were following the hashtag were sharing, the gender pay gap in organisations who were celebrating their female staff, sharing the disparity of women that are sitting on the boards, sharing, if we look at sport, sharing the pay gap across the men and the women in sort of national and international representation. So although we need to shine a light on the good stuff that's happening to kind of narrow that gap, we also really need to be cognizant that just putting a hashtag at the end of something really is not providing opportunity for women to access the world in an equal way, whether that's in a sporting context or whether that's across the business world. So, I find myself a little bit frustrated when I see, International Women's Day, having initially really been galvanized and inspired by it, kind of a few years on now, I'm starting to think, well, we can hashtag all we like, but unless we're prepared to be really brave about change and really be brave about talking about women and the role of women in the workplace and the challenges for women that are different for men, but also without making that, gender difference the whole story about a woman and a man's place in the world. It's part of the story, isn't it? And part of the story that's important because of the differences between men and women and because of the different ways that life unfolds quite often for men and women.
So we're going to get into all this. I think it's really, really encouraging to hear about you talk about the deeper issues. I do also think there's some solutions to be had there that are easier wins, partly looking at the positives that have come from it. And rightly so, when these probably movements started happening more a few years ago, there was that initial inertia of talking about what it really means and why we're celebrating it. But I think the interesting thing you picked out on there were around the biological differences. And we're not just talking here about the obvious, but actually the conversations that we're hearing at executive level and filtering down companies is around trying to provide support for things like menopause support, things like understanding more about the imposter syndrome that people might well feel. And those conversations are happening, which is positive. So do you want to tell us a little bit about why these are so important?
Yeah, and I suppose it really goes down to understanding that those biological differences have an effect on the way that individuals' brains are shaped. And obviously, it's a spectrum. So, there will be men who in uterine were exposed to higher levels of estrogen, so present with more feminine characteristics, and there will be women who in uterine were exposed to higher levels of testosterone, and the impact of those different sex hormones shapes the way that individuals' brains develop. So the estrogen, the female sex hormone, or primarily female sex hormone, men obviously have some estrogen, it's just stored and released from different tissues, but the female sex hormone really is driven towards neuro adaptation in the centers of the brain that are responsible for relationships and that are responsible for communication. And if you think about that kind of evolutionarily, it makes sense because women are structurally smaller and weaker, and I say that as a female who beats up lots of men generally in the boxing gym.
In the boxing ring.
In the boxing ring. But we are because of the impact of testosterone, we are smaller and we have less physical strength. So if you and I are negotiating for our place in the pecking order, I'm not going to do that through physical prowess. I'm going to try and talk my way into that relationship, or talk my way out of a problem situation. But I also need to build relationships so that I've got strength in numbers. So women form bonds with women, I suppose, more of a grouping. There's more of a biological drive towards group for women, because when we look at, when we were living in caves, if I was going to go off and fight with somebody or try and, take on a man, I needed to make sure that there was somebody available either to come and support me, because I'm not going to win on my own, or to look after my offspring if, I don't make it back from that interaction. So, we haven't really evolved from that place of women being much more driven towards kind of relationship, looking for social connection, and really being, I suppose, the peacekeeper. So that they, look to please, look to kind of acceptance, whereas men are, much more driven towards aggression, towards competition, towards wanting to win, because they want to be the dominant species in that pack. They want to be the dominant animal in that pack. So when we translate that to the workplace, there's obviously going to be differences in the way that, I suppose, people approach work. We might see that our male employees are a little bit more singularly driven, a little bit more, looking for that climb up the ladder at the expense of maybe some of their other colleagues. There might be a little bit more aggression in how they approach work, whereas women will be still looking, as they climb that ladder, still looking for acceptance from their colleagues. They'll still be looking to keep the peace, to keep everybody happy, to, make sure that they don't upset anybody as they're climbing up that ladder.
It's really interesting because we aligned a bit of data with that as well around the concepts of the biological differences. And throughout the lockdown period, albeit it does seem a long time ago, we actually compared the male and female scenarios, and we found that the stress levels and actual physiological stress elements of that went through the roof for the women working at home. Whereas conversely, the men found themselves a lot more focused on what it was they had to do and didn't necessarily take in other lifestyle factors. So even as you said there, that singularity of the male approach and psyche compared to that empathetic, more all-rounded approach of the women, albeit they are slightly generalized, but our data did back that up. Almost all of the candidates that were tested were showing similar trends within that as well. But I think one thing you talked about there was about empathy and the social connections that women often create. Now, when we talk about leadership and specifically leadership coaching, one of the first things you try and work out is where people are on their spectrum of directive and non-directive coaching, if you like, and where they best place. And it tends to be that when the female conversations talk around their own empathy, they see it as weakness often. Yet it's one of the best traits that a leader can have, to understand other people more. So from your perspective, and certainly from a scientific background, how can you benefit from that empathy shown and those social connections that are sought from these women?
Yeah, well, that estrogen has an impact on the language centers of the brain as well. So just in terms of communication skill and adaptability of communication style, in principle, theoretically, women are more adept to that. So women will use, and it's sort of borne out in the evidence base, women will use considerably more words than men over the course of the day. They'll look to explain and interact using a wider variety of vocabulary. And I think that lends itself to that, I suppose, that leadership style of being able to really interact with your workforce in a way that's meaningful to them. If you're able to adapt your communication style really effectively, then you're able to best communicate with the individual who's in front of you. And that's what really good leadership's about, isn't it? It's about not just leading in your style, but being able to bring along your workforce, particularly now that Gen Z, but they want to have a place of work where they feel like they have purpose, and where they feel like they have an opportunity to direct the purpose of the company. And that really lends itself to good communication. It requires leaders who can communicate on an individualized, personable kind of strategy, not the same for everybody. And I think people who can do that really do get the most out of their workforce, and get the most out of the workforce whilst keeping them happy.
This is one question that spans from that, actually, and it was a conversation I had just the other day. And I said, look, we're doing these chats around things such as RWD, talking about, you know, menopause in the workplace, that type of thing. And one thing they mentioned, and I said, would it be okay for me to make a question? They said it was, this is it. So in terms of what they were saying, it's about initiating the conversation about their experiences. And it was a slightly older female member of a team, still in a leadership format, so in that, you know, higher echelons of the company. And she found it difficult to initiate these conversations. So if people are listening to this that perhaps absolutely resonate with what you've just said, what would be the starting point, do you think, to advance that conversation further within the company?
I think that female leaders and male leaders need to have the sort of the approach of every woman is different. So, you know, the female experience as the male experience, although the fluctuation of male hormones is much less than that of female. So, you know, over the course of a month, the impact of those fluctuating hormones in a woman who is menstruating means that at certain points of that month, over that cycle, energy levels might be different, mood might be different, the way that, you know, for better or for worse, you know, the role of those changing estrogen and progesterone levels means that at certain points of the month, women are hyper focused, you know, really have exceptional adaptability in terms of their cognitive skills. But for a few days a month, that might be a challenge, you know. And as we move through towards perimenopause and menopause, the reduction in and the change in the predominance of estradiol, the sort of menstruating form of estrogen, means that some of those cognitive skills can start to be a challenge. And I suppose it's being really aware of that, being aware that the experience is different for everybody, but also making it part of the normal conversation, so that, you know, if I suddenly start to notice that I'm feeling less focused in work, because it's part of our conversation across the staff workforce, that, you know, menopause has this effect, perimenopause has this effect, my menstrual cycle has this effect, I might not feel like I'm isolated, because actually that social connection is really important in terms of mental health, but it also is important in terms of performance. You know, so if I feel like I'm isolated, that withdrawal effect will have a negative impact both on my emotional well-being, but it will also start to negatively impact my performance at work. So if we can be open, we can have conversation about, you know, just what is a normal process for every woman that, you know, experiences menstruation, that goes through menopause, then the symptoms, the experience becomes conversation, and it becomes part of that strategy around how we support everybody to perform their best, which is really what we want to do, isn't it? You know, we're all about how do we help and support people to maximize their performance, both in the workplace, but also not at the expense of their kind of health and well-being.
Well, that's intriguing. It's always an education listening to you, Rach. Always is. I think, you know, for people listening to this who perhaps want to take those messages away, then that's great. One thing that is the last point we're probably going to discuss, actually, but it's a very unspoken about element within sport. Clearly, with the title being Workathlete, we cover both of those areas, and specifically menstruation in sport, and how that is just a conversation that often does not happen. Obviously, should
at all.
What are your thoughts on this, Rach? I know it's slightly off topic, but
well, it's a really important conversation, because 90% of female athletes never have that conversation with their coach, and there are some really important performance risks for not having that. So if you look at, so I've had 3 ACL ruptures at this point. I know I only have 2 ACLs. I've re-ruptured a repair. An ACL rupture is significantly greater in women because of the role of progesterone and estrogen and progesterone on ligament. So when we're in sort of that high hormone state, that although we have some real benefits in terms of muscular performance, so when I've got, you know, I'm sitting with that higher level of estrogen, that my capacity for work is higher, my ligament laxity actually increases. So the ability of a ligament to translate tension through it and to support tissue tension is reduced. So in that stage, in that phase, if if you're somebody who has high levels of estrogen, your risk of injury, of serious injury, is really quite increased. You know, it's really significant. And it's not something that anybody ever had a conversation with me about. Even after I'd had a couple of ruptures, nobody ever had that conversation with me. But it affects performance across the whole of that cycle. And it will be different. You know, I'm not saying that every single woman who has a period has moments of the month where they feel awful or where performance is reduced, but they won't know unless they start to track it and to manage their cycle through monitoring in the way that we would monitor our sleep, our steps, our, you know, hydration. That's the key. Data is king. You know, when you can look across 3-4 months and you can say, okay, every day on day 12 of my cycle, where I'm starting to peak in terms of my estrogen production, I feel really energized, and this is the day I'm going to max out. But then you might look and you might say, oh, day 22, 23, I'm peaking progesterone. You know, I'm starting to feel really tired. My coordination's gone now. I'm catabolic. I'm in a catabolic state, so I don't recover very well. In that phase, I shouldn't really be looking to lift heavy. I should be looking at doing skill type work. But I won't know that unless I've taken the time to put into my diary, into my record, that this is how it's having an impact of me. And I think that's the key for all women, really, is just making a diary, making a plan, tracking how it affects you, tracking how it affects your sleep, tracking how it affects your body temperature, tracking your mood, tracking your hydration. You know, we could go on for a really extended period. You know, the impact that the hormones have on hydration is really quite significant. So, you know, in those high progesterone state, that sort of after you've ovulated and you haven't, you know, if you're not pregnant, then progesterone increases so that we start the cycle again. But in that progesterone state, that our blood plasma volume reduces, but at the same time, we actually get suppression of thirst. So women quite often in that kind of phase of their cycle can be dehydrated, but without having that drive for thirst. But because that blood plasma volume's lower, there's some challenges there around electrolyte balance. So I suppose it's really knowing how you feel, and you'll know because you'll know how your energy is, you know, and we could go back time and time again to that energy management piece. And if we're tracking and monitoring our energy and our mood, we can get a really good oversight of where we might implement strategies in order to help ourselves feel and perform better.
So, Rach, I think in the space of that probably 4 minutes there, where you were talking around the theories of what sport does to try and prevent and understand more around the cycles of women, you've just highlighted why a day like International Women's Day is only really the starting point of what is a huge conversation that needs to happen very often. The whole point of Workathlete, we look at what sport is doing, we apply it to businesses. That is case in point for how people can understand more, increase conversations, and more importantly than that, do something about it. Rach, always insightful. I think you've actually just topped the charts in terms of what people are going to take away from this. Reams of notes written down. Thank you once again for providing that insight, and we should see you next week for the next Workathlete Performance Chat.
See you later.